Hello and welcome to our panel discussion on the taxonomy put to the capital markets test. Everyone working in the field of sustainable finance, probably anywhere in the world, has heard of the taxonomy, or to give it its full name, the EU Taxonomy of Sustainable Economic Activities. A much smaller number of people can explain what it is, and even fewer have a clear grasp of how it will actually be used and what it will mean for the market. And we're lucky enough to have four of those best qualified people here today to enlighten us about their experience so far. Nobody has all the answers, but people who've been working intensively on this certainly have experiences that will be very relevant to everybody else. So I'm going to begin by asking the panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Isabelle.
Good morning. I'm Isabelle Laurent. I'm Deputy Treasurer and Head of Funding at European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And I work on the funding side where we raise money through green bonds, but EBRD has a much more extensive interaction with the taxonomy than just through the funding side.
Thank you. David?
Yes, hello, John. My name is David Marques Pereira. I am working at DZ Bank in the Sustainable Finance team, and I'm working as an ESG originator. So we help issuers to come to the market on their sustainable travel, on their sustainable voyage, to issue green, social, sustainability bonds, and to help them to come in touch with this complex but beautiful topic.
Thank you. Tricia?
Thanks, John. Hi, I'm Tricia. I have recently joined Deutsche Bank, where I head up the ESG advisory team. It's a team that works across the investment bank and capital markets to help clients integrate ESG into their capital raising activities, but also to better understand the ESG investment landscape. And prior to this, I was in Sustainalytics for 5 years.
Thank you. Aldo?
Okay, so good morning, everybody. I am head of sustainability funding in the capital markets department of the European Investment Bank. The European Investment Bank is the bank of the European Union and therefore a test case, in fact, for the application also of the taxonomy going forward.
Thank you. So as we go through the discussion, we invite everyone watching to put in questions. It's your opportunity to ask questions to this expert panel. And you can use the chat function in Hub. Just underneath your screen where you've got the video part is a field where you can type in questions. So please do that. And we'll endeavor to answer them at the end in the live Q&A part of the discussion. Furthermore, if you, when we get to the live Q&A, which we'll get to by, you'll just click on a separate link that'll be displayed on your screen. You then can also ask a question, as it were, face-to-face by sort of raising your hand, and the moderator will then ask you to actually ask it. So to start with, let's just have a very quick go at defining what the taxonomy is. And perhaps, Tricia, I could ask you to start with that.
Sure, absolutely. I think the taxonomy is a list of eligible activities. It's a common definition of what constitutes green in Europe, keeping in mind the 2050 decarbonization target for the European Union. And perhaps Aldo and Isabelle would have a better or more eloquent definition of it. But essentially, I think it is a list of economic activities that contribute to net zero by 2050 for the EU.
So, okay, it's a list of green economic activities. Aldo, how much of the economy does that actually describe?
I would like to complete the definition, if you don't mind, first, because the taxonomy, I would like to explain why the European Commission has intervened in this field, since the approach that the Commission has taken is a market-oriented approach. As you know, the Commission has exclusive competence for competition within the European space. And the idea is that in a market where sustainable finance is of growing importance, the market itself cannot work properly if everybody is in a position to define by itself what is green and what is not. So the idea is to define, based on a concerted approach, a consensus-based set of definitions and criteria that permit the market to judge in an objective way what are the core features of sustainability that indeed the market can finance using different financial instruments. And this is an important decision, because the idea is that the market should be working better thanks to this grid of definitions. Now, it is a very difficult task, as we all know, and this is exactly why official authorities have intervened in this field. And it is also a process that cannot be, let's say, conducted in such a way that the whole economy can be mapped at once. In the past 3 years, the Commission has been, and more specifically in the past 1.5, the Commission has, with the help of experts from all possible interested parties, tried to come to terms with a core definition of what serves two major objectives of sustainability, which are climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. So this is the first area that is going to be covered by the taxonomy. A formal taxonomy will be adopted by the end of the year for implementation at the end of next year. And other environmental objectives will be covered later on. So first of all, at this moment, nothing is really covered because the Commission still has to confirm the first round of taxonomy decisions that will apply to climate only. And even within the area of the activities that serve climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation, only the ones that are contributing more substantially to pollution are indeed considered. So there are a number of areas that are definitely not covered yet by the taxonomy.
Okay, thanks, Aldo. That's very clear to get us started. So I'd like to turn really to the question of how it's being used in the market. And, you know, all of you are market practitioners, first and foremost, doing real jobs in the capital markets. So, and as Aldo said, the taxonomy doesn't actually come into force until the end of 2021. Yet, it's clearly something that people are having to get to grips with already. So perhaps, David, for you, as a banker working with clients on deals, what does it mean?
Well, hello, John, and thanks for accepting me and DZ Bank on this panel. Hello also to Isabelle, Trisha, and Aldo. It is a pleasure for me to be on this virtual stage with you here. What does it mean, actually? Do market participants pay attention to the taxonomy or not? I think in order to answer this, let's have a quick look at the past in order to find out how much the market participants paid attention to previous and existing guidelines. We have seen the ICMA, the International Capital Market Association, publishing the first edition of the Green Bond Principles in 2014. And it started as a voluntary guideline. It still is basically, since no green bond issuer is actually obliged to be aligned with the 4 core elements of the Green Bond Principles. But I rarely see nowadays any green bonds that is not aligned with the Green Bond Principles. Even before that, we saw the Climate Bonds Initiative, I think it was in December 2010, launching the Climate Bond Standards and Verification Scheme. So in order to help investors and other market participants, of course, to classify and to prioritize their investments that effectively address climate change. Anyway, it was due to an own dynamic of the market and also of the market participants that these voluntary guidelines got adapted by the issuers step by step. Especially the Green Bond Principles are the market standard nowadays, and also one quality stamp, besides other quality stamps, of course, too, like the Luxembourg Green Exchange or the CBI certification. Regarding the taxonomy, John, what you said, I would say that we see for the first time also a voluntary guideline coming to the market, but there is a difference. It is not a self-development of the market itself alone, but initiated and driven from within, from inside the political sphere, from the EU with the EU Commission and the TEC, finally defining one common language of what is actually sustainable, so something that the market has been looking for. Before that, I think there was also the CBI that has done an excellent job and is still doing an excellent job, and they set up some thresholds, for example, when it comes to freight and passenger transportation. But the taxonomy goes one step further, even 2 steps further. As Aldo already said, it looks into almost each single economic activity, into many economic activities along the NACE codes, and covers, I think, more than 90% of the greenhouse gas emissions originating from these sectors in the EU, in order to define what is actually sustainable or not. And to answer the question, are market participants paying attention to it or not? If we have a look at the Green Bond Principles, the market participants paid slowly attention until it developed into an own standard that everyone took as granted, let's say it like this. And regarding the taxonomy, I would say yes, market participants are aware of the taxonomy, not fully yet, because it is still an ongoing process, as Aldo said, but the level of attention is slowly increasing. We have seen some issuances lately where within the respective framework or in the debt issuance documentation, there was a loose reference or a strong reference to the taxonomy. For example, the German Agricultural Development Bank, the Rentenbank, refers to the EU taxonomy in its recently published Green Bond Framework. It is the first Green Bond Framework they published, and it states that the issuer tries, on a best effort basis, to implement the taxonomy and the EU Green Bond Standard in this framework. And the day before yesterday, I think, we saw the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg coming to the market with a sustainability bond. And if you take a look into the sustainability bond framework that had been published 5 days before or 1 week before, it is to highlight that the green part, so the green environmental projects, are already partly in the majority aligned with the taxonomy. The second party opinion provider confirms that the majority of the use of the proceeds categories are in line with the threshold of the taxonomy. This so far on the issuing side. Another example is the German Regional Development Bank, NRW Bank, that just established a green refinancing curve on the lending side, offering interest subsidized loans for projects that are in line with the thresholds and the technical screening criteria as mentioned in the taxonomy, which is an example that market participants do not only pay attention to the taxonomy on the issuing side, but also when you talk about banks or agencies on the lending side. And this shows to me that this framework, the taxonomy, is slowly penetrating different parts of the sustainable finance market. And to conclude my argumentation, regardless if market participants want to pay attention or not, some of them will sooner or later have to pay attention to it. For example, institutional investors that will have to disclose how and to what extent environmental targets are addressed in their portfolios. And companies, I think, of a certain size will have to report about the turnover, capex, and I think also selected OPEX that are in line with the taxonomy.
Yeah. Thank you, David. So, Tricia, I'm going to ask you, I mean, David has described the way issuers particularly are using the taxonomy, particularly in the context of preparing green and sustainability bonds. And he says they're paying attention to the categories in the taxonomy and trying to align their frameworks with it. So if you disagree or have anything to add on that, please say. But I also want to ask you about investors, because as David referred to, investors, of course, the taxonomy is for their benefit in a sense. And so how do you think investors are getting to grips with it?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and it goes back to the first question of what is the taxonomy, and it is often misunderstood to be a compliance tool when I think it is more of a disclosure tool. And same for investors. I think when they're looking to, when they're looking for green investments, they're certainly not looking or using the taxonomy as a tool to make investment decisions, and saying they're only going to invest in green bonds, for example, that are 100% compliant with the taxonomy. Maybe the market heads there at a certain point in time in the future, but I think that the taxonomy is very much a disclosure tool, and what investors are asking for is to disclose against the taxonomy. So at a portfolio level, they're able to say, well, 10% of my portfolio, is green in the way the taxonomy describes it, and the remaining 90% is not. And perhaps over time, that 10% increases to 40 or 50. And so similarly, I think that's really what's driving issuers as well to use the taxonomy in the way Luxembourg used it, which I think is a really good example. And certainly the Luxembourg deal is notable because it was a sustainability bond that referenced the EU taxonomy, right? And so it comprised social use of proceeds, but still referenced the green standard. So I think that's notable. It's a good example because really what they're doing is saying, well, our bond, our sustainable bond, aligns to a certain percentage with the EU taxonomy. Doesn't comply 100% with all the criteria and do no harm, but it still contributes to a certain extent. And I think that was well received by investors. So.
Thank you, Tricia. So Isabelle, as an issuer that issued a lot of green bonds before the taxonomy and is going to continue to do so afterwards, it's coming into your life. Obviously, you've heard a lot about it over the last few years, and the EBRD has contributed to developing the standard. But what are we actually learning about the taxonomy now that we can see it up close? And it's no longer a theory, but it's actually a working document.
Well, I think that one of the interesting parts of the taxonomy is that it feeds on other work that has previously been done. So, if you look at these 6 objectives of the taxonomy, they map pretty well to the 10 project categories and the objectives of the Green Bond Principles. So there is that sort of reasonable link. But there are some things that we've seen historically in the green bond market that were very restrictive in the sense that it was pretty much all focused on mitigation and not very focused on other areas. And I think that the language of the taxonomy in thinking a bit about this division between what is deep green, which is very much what had been the focus of the green bond market, and what are transition activities, i.e. things that we absolutely need to transition to net zero, but are currently not operating at that level at all. They may even be very high emitting sectors, and how we need to think about those. And then a third set, which are all the sort of enabling activities that enable both the deep green and the transition. So if you think about your steel for your electric cars or for your green buildings or for your wind turbines, again, you need to think about those different aspects. So, boilers and so on. So all of these manufacturing activities that also need to change. And I think that sort of galvanized that particular focus on these divisions and thinking about transition and enabling has galvanized the green bond market as well. And so many of us, and EBRD has actually issued a green transition bond, have started to think more about the notion of transition activities and what more we need to be doing and what is required of those in order for it to work. I think the difficulty in terms of the use for green funding is the aspect of where your projects are. So, this focuses a lot on the EU, and many of us have projects that span a much wider region and developing regions. So often the sort of levels that are implied within the taxonomy, rather than the thinking within it, are the bits that may become a little less wieldy. And if you think about 10-year assets and you think about, or longer, the average of our green assets in our that back green bonds tend to be much longer than 10 years. And the whole, the taxonomy criteria is going to be subject to 3-year revisions in relation to the transition. So again, that may make things a little less wieldy from that perspective. But I think that the areas, as I say, where perhaps the language aspect is clearest are things that overlap. So there's a notion of do no significant harm, which you see echoed in the green bond principles, where it talks about managing risks and disclosing risks. So they're not quite the same thing, because do no significant harm sounds a little more concerning, in a sense that it may be very difficult to attest to the fact that your project does no significant harm. But if you talk about how you scrutinize your projects for risks and harms in other areas and disclose those, and how you manage or mitigate them, that at least is a language that is understandable. And I think another area, very quickly, is that in the requirements, one of the 4 requirements under the taxonomy is that you must comply with robust science-based technical screening criteria. And I think that we are seeing aspects of that come into sustainability-linked bonds, into the whole transition discussion under green bonds. So there's definitely a feed-through whether people are actually going to find it easy to apply the specifics of the taxonomy to their projects, especially when they're not based in Europe, may be a different thing, but at least we're talking a common language, which I think is also a very significant part.
Thank you. Well, Aldo, I know that having a common language, was one of the original purposes of the taxonomy. And, to enable people not necessarily to agree on what was sustainable, but at least to be able to have the conversation clearly. So I'm interested in to what extent you think the taxonomy is actually facilitating that, but also as an issuer too, like the EBRD, you're now having to think about your green and sustainable assets. Do they fit into the taxonomy? Can your green and climate action bonds and so on, qualify? What's that process like? Is it more difficult than you perhaps expected?
Well, it is a complex process because reality is complex. But also linking to what the other participants in the panel have said before, I think, first of all, it is important to make a distinction between the taxonomy and the taxonomy regulation that entered into force in July. The taxonomy regulation provides the legal framework for dealing with these matters. And I think it is important to highlight this because it is an enabling framework, as you have heard. So this area was characterized, and I'm not talking about finance only, because in fact the confusion is in the underlying economy as to what is green, as what is sustainable, how to measure that, and so on and so forth. And the taxonomy regulation has, in a way, normed the way in which people now address these subjects. In order to do so, there has been an effort towards clarifying what could be agreed upon. And with regard to the taxonomy, I think it is important to make a distinction between the structure of the taxonomy and the parameters that will define the European standard. This is absolutely essential because...
Sorry, do you mean, just to interrupt, do you mean the European Green Bond Standard?
No, I'm just referring, well, the taxonomy is in itself a standard. European Green Bond Standard is the way, or describes the way in which the taxonomy should be applied in the field of green bonds, which is immediately impacted by this. But what I'm referring to is the fact that, just to be extremely concrete, when you speak of technical screening criteria, you must indeed clarify what is the core feature that you are observing, what are the indicators that you are going to use to measure the substantial contribution to that, and then you have to fix a threshold. Now, the threshold may be different in Europe and elsewhere, but it must be clear that the core features we are talking about are the same everywhere. So I consider that these first two elements. So what is that we want to measure? And what is that we use to measure that need to be agreed at international level. And this is an important element which has structured the discussion and is going to structure the discussion not only within the EU platform for sustainable finance that the Commission will use to, for example, develop the discussion on the environmental areas beyond climate, but also internationally in the context of the International Platform for Sustainable Finance that the Commission has established as a platform for discussion and that already now sees, for example, important participants specifically in the working group on taxonomy like China. So this is a very important progress vis-à-vis the past, okay? Now, when you turn to implementation, of course, the European Investment Bank is the Bank of the European Union. And as you know, we started to engage very concrete in a mapping of the China catalog, for example, already in 2016, 2017. And we have used that work in the area of climate to indeed also start a number of conversations with market participants, peers, but also external reviewers that have backed also our technical proposals into the subgroup on taxonomy within the technical expert group. So now, when it comes to implementation, we need to take into account, and this is another very important element of the approach that the Commission has kickstarted, we have to take into account that regulation, so the regulation on the establishment of a framework to facilitate sustainable investment, this is the real name of the taxonomy regulation, is a law. And it is a law that has immediate application in all member countries. And this is why, by the way, possible because indeed the Commission is acting in the area of competition where it has exclusive competence. So people by necessity are now starting to think and confront and compare within this framework, and they have to do, because as I mentioned at the beginning, not everything is covered, even in the areas that we are discussing, not everything is covered, but for example, the EU Green Bond Standard that you were quoting a moment ago foresees the possibility that where a taxonomy does not exist yet, who decides is in fact the issuer. It is the issuer that can clarify what is the objective that he is pursuing and what indicators it is going to use in order to measure the contribution of the economic activities that he is going to finance with the proceeds, for example, of a green bond. So this is a very important element because within the framework that is created, this will lead to an ongoing comparison under the scrutiny of the market that will take things forward in a pragmatic manner. As I mentioned before, the proof is in the pudding. And to me, sincerely speaking, the framework and the enabling framework is even more important than the taxonomy itself. Now, with regard specifically to the EIB, and here I conclude, we have the whole bank is moving now in the direction of a reassessment, reclassification of the activities based on taxonomy regulation compliant criteria. This permits, by the way, also has permitted already for us to extend the scope of coverage of our climate awareness bond, our franchise. You know that we issued the first green bond back in 2007 with a focus on renewable energy and energy efficiency. That are only two of the areas that are covered by the taxonomy. So this reclassification has already produced a result, and in June this year, upon adoption of the taxonomy regulation, the EIB has announced that it will be able to extend already, that it has decided to extend the possible allocations from climate awareness bonds to two further areas of its activities. Why is this important? Because in the context of the European Green Deal, for example, the bank has committed to or has set as an objective the fact that by 2025 it will have to have at least 50% of its new lending in green. Yeah. So this is just a test case and an example of what I was saying before.
Okay, thanks, Albert.
It is a rolling on process that has started.
I think we're getting a sense that issuers and no doubt other market participants are realizing that it's not cut and dried, that there is room for interpretation, and as Aldo mentioned, that the issuer, you know, on areas where the taxonomy is silent, the initiative remains with the issuer as to how they disclose. But another aspect you've raised, Aldo, is the international dimension, and this obviously is very important. Capital markets are global, and you know, the EU can't just create a standard in isolation. So, David, perhaps you could talk to us a bit about how the EU taxonomy is going to interact and be used outside in the rest of the world. Could it be a standard that is then becomes the basis for a global standard, or is that problematic? What's your sense of how it's being received?
Well, how Aldo already said, I think the People's Bank of China and two other major financial institutions from the Asian area are developing a Chinese green bond, a Chinese green definition, a taxonomy themselves. And we are seeing that in Canada, a taxonomy about transitional activities is also being developed. And as far as I know, the Canadians are in close cooperation with the EU Commission. So there is already a cooperation from the European Union with other market participants, with other countries or regions in the world. And so in the middle, there is the European Union with the taxonomy. And I would say that the taxonomy alone would not be able or would not have the power to become an international standard if it was not also together with the EU Green Bond Standard. Because the EU Green Bond Standard actually links the taxonomy, the activities in the taxonomy, in how a green bond should be structured. And if you think, many of the green bond issuances we have seen already followed a certain standard in Europe and also outside Europe, namely the green bond principles. So at first sight, you could argue that the market already had and still has one standard, or let's call it maybe a best practice approach, for which actually no new green bond standard is needed. So a taxonomy might be enough. But I would say that the EU Green Bond Standard is necessary, although, as I think Isabelle said, it is actually largely based on the existing market practice, on the green bond principles. But there is one difference. The EU Green Bond Standard is a framework linked to a taxonomy which has the potential to become a new standard, maybe also a global standard. Maybe also, I would say, the new normal, an encyclopedia of sustainable activities. And by giving us a definition of what is actually green, or let's say an environmental sustainable economic activity, the EU Green Bond Standard not only links investments to the taxonomy, this is correct, but I would go even one step further and say that it links at the same time the investments. It closes the gap between the investments and international goals, like the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and at the same time also with a 2-degree or 1.5-degree Paris Agreement. I mean, let's be honest, we are seriously lagging behind when it comes to the Paris Agreement and climate goals. Going directly towards what I have heard to a 3-degree future. And it is true that we have seen a decline in greenhouse gas emissions this year, but it was mostly related to the cooling down of the economy against the background of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we see first signs that this development was only temporary, leading directly to a rebound effect. The same as it happens after 2008, after the global financial crisis. And if we want to achieve these goals on an international level, an effective, a remarkable, and also a sizable impact is needed. And the taxonomy tells us what these thresholds are to succeed. And after the pandemic is over, it is upon investors worldwide not only to invest in profit, but also in impact in order to achieve the climate goals. So I think the taxonomy has the potential to become a global standard, or maybe a reference, I would say, a reference for other global participants, similar as it happened to the green bond principles, as issuers will find it easier, thanks to the taxonomy and the EU Green Bond Standard, to align their debt issuance program with the taxonomy, thanks to these guidelines. And as long as they have the necessary eligible projects, nothing will change about this. And what is also nice, what was mentioned before by Isabelle and Aldo, is that the taxonomy itself allows improvement measures and enabling activities in order to make an operation or a project aligned with the thresholds. So The taxonomy, together with the EU Green Bond Standard, is not only created in order to include already green economic sectors, but also those ones who cannot become totally green overnight. For example, the cement industry. I think before it was mentioned the steel industry. So the taxonomy, together with the EU Green Bond Standard, allows a cement producer to refinance projects that pave the way to be considered green or transitional, let's say. And in order to conclude, I would say yes, the taxonomy already has an impact, is already having an impact on international issuers. And together with the Green Bond Standard, it will be a guideline not only to facilitate the creation of a green bond framework or an issuance of a green bond, but also to make it more credible worldwide. So let's not forget, for example, that just one small detail, that the EU Green Bond Standard requires an external verification of the framework and also the allocation report, leading to a higher degree and transparency. And these factors, these characteristics, give the taxonomy the potential, together with the EU Green Bond Standard, to become a global reference.
Thanks, David. Tricia, I'm interested in your thoughts on that same point. And Aldo referred, in fact, to the taxonomy sort of defining what are the characteristics that we need to talk about, essentially, and then for the potential for different countries, perhaps, or different groups of one kind or another to define the level of acceptability for each criterion. Now, I'm interested in whether you think that is realistic. So, for example, Canada or China, if they are developing their own standards, will they map on to those of the EU, but perhaps at different levels? Or is it more likely that they actually sort of conflict?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so maybe 2 points, right? I think the first is how global is the EU taxonomy really? And the second is, as nations develop their own, to what extent will they map onto it? And on the first point, I think I probably disagree slightly with David, as you said, capital markets are global. And anyone raising capital in Europe, whether they're an American issuer, Canadian issuer, Chinese issuer, I think will be asked to what degree are they considering the EU taxonomy. So I do think that it will have global impact on issuers everywhere, particularly since Europe is one of the largest ESG investor bases in the world, right? So I think because there's a big proportion of the European investment community that is focused on ESG, and because a good proportion of those investors are getting regulated to disclose on their dedicated green funds and their ESG products in relation to the taxonomy, I think issuers anywhere raising capital in Europe will likely start to get questions on the EU taxonomy. I think the second question, right, which is to what extent will localized capital markets sort of harmonize with the way EU is considering and doing things. I think that's an interesting one, and being Canadian myself, I suspect that the Canadian transition definition will differ slightly from Europe, or substantially from Europe, and because Canada is a different economy, and the European taxonomy is based on the objective of net zero by 2050, right? And it's based on European Paris Agreement goals. So the extent to which international taxonomy is harmonized, I think, I would hope that it would be to a large extent, but practically I suspect it may not be. But certainly in the interest of global capital markets, I would hope that, there is sort of a more global, internationally harmonized definition of sort of green or transition.
Yeah, because otherwise it could actually lead to fragmentation, couldn't it? I'd like to come, and I think, Isabelle, perhaps you could start on this topic, to the social aspect, because obviously, many green bond issuers, including the EBRD and EIB, have social mission as well as an environmental one. The social bond market exists. The investors in the ESG space care about social issues as well as environmental ones. So obviously, so far they've been coping without any taxonomy. But there has been talk of the taxonomy eventually spreading, once it's covered all the environmental objectives, into the social sphere. I'm interested to know whether you think that's desirable. Is that something that you sort of wish would happen sooner rather than later, or would that sort of make life difficult in that area too?
It's difficult because, I don't want to damn the value of having a common language. But, one of the things, and we haven't yet addressed it in relation to the green taxonomy, that's especially difficult for a lot of us in trying to relate what we have in terms of our projects to the taxonomy, is the difficulty that you have between translating economic activities into projects, because projects often have a multiplicity of economic activities, and also in terms of the objectives, that the whole basis of the taxonomy is that you have one significant objective, even if it's got other ones, and then you've got the risks aspect that do no significant harm. And that's not how the green bond or social bond especially work. They don't. They do expect meaningful change, meaningful impact in the environmental side or on the social bond side for on the social, but it doesn't narrow you to having it in one objective. So you could end up having a very good green project that has a sort of multiplicity of benefits, all of which are pretty meaningful and collectively are meaningful, but not in one area. So I think that's one of the difficulties when using it in the green space, where you've got actual easier to measure impact. So you can say, this is my baseline, this is my benchmark, this is what this particular objective, environmental objective, how you might measure it. And indeed, in the green bond principles, we've been working now for many years on looking at each project category and looking at impact. And what is harder in the social sphere is defining impact. So a lot of the time we're looking at output measures. Sometimes we're even looking just at input measures. So you've got the range between inputs. I'm doing this particular thing, creating this amount. And you've got outputs. And then you've got outcomes. Impact is further on than that. And what the taxonomy is looking at is generally in terms of impact. So seeing this greenhouse gas emission reduction, this minimization of water usage, so actual impacts. In the social sphere, it's very much harder to have the same kind of translation. So in general, social projects talk about the number of people benefiting from this, the number of waste disposal, but houses served by this wastewater or waste disposal. It's very different type of metric, and I think it's going to be much harder potentially in the social sphere to have the same kinds of translation mechanisms as you have in the environmental, where it's easier to find impact. So there are difficulties even using it in the environmental. I think that with the social, it's going to be much more amorphous and much harder to grapple with, where you say this matters and this doesn't. And especially when things need to translate potentially into multiple benefits rather than a single one. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, that's very interesting. David, do you think you're active, obviously, in the social bond market? Do you agree with Isabelle?
Yes, I totally agree with Isabelle regarding the question if it could be a help or a hindrance, the social bond taxonomy, for example. I mean, 2020 is the year where a social definition, a known taxonomy, might come into the head of many people. let's have a look at this year's transactions in the sustainable bond market. We saw that the green bond issuance took a break in Q1. I think the new issuance volume of green transaction was the lowest in March since 2015 because of the starting pandemic. So many issuers started to postpone the issuance of green bonds to the second half of the year. And indeed, we are seeing that the green bond market is recovering. But on the other hand, what happened this year is that the issuance of social and sustainability bonds boomed. Also because of the so-called COVID-19 related bonds or COVID-19 response bonds. There are different names for them. And because of this, we saw that many social and sustainability bonds this year had mostly two eligible project categories. On the one hand, it was the access to basic healthcare service, which included the upgrade of hospitals and medical centers in order to mitigate the infection risk inside the buildings, and at a later stage also to be prepared for a possible second wave. And the second project category that we saw was supporting small and medium enterprises and microfinance, since most of the lockdown measures brought small enterprises on the edge of existence.
But so, David, do you think a taxonomy would help with putting together such deals, or would it make it more difficult?
Exactly. Against the background of this issuance we saw this year, I would say it would rather. I rather tend to say it for the latter one. It is actually a help, because more than the green bonds, the impact reporting to measure the real effect of my investment or my issuance has on society is much more difficult to measure, as Isabelle pointed out. So we are talking about metrics that go far beyond the quantitative ones like CO2 or CO2 equivalents. Namely, we're talking about social ones. Social housing is a very good example. Asking the question as an issue, for example, refinancing social house projects. What do you consider to be a so-called vulnerable population that you mentioned in the social bond framework, for example? And how do you measure your effect? Do you link the average income of this population to the national income level, or do you implement it the macroeconomic purchasing power parity? And how do you measure the impact? By the numbers of rooms you refinance, by the numbers of square meters? There are already some guidelines by the International Capital Market Association within the framework of the harmonized framework for impacts on social bonds. So we could say that we are basically in the same situation as 2 or 3 years ago, where before publishing the EU taxonomy, where the market relied only on the green bond principles. Now we have the social bond principles and the sustainability bond guidelines. And if you think that the so-called taxonomy for environmental activities will accelerate the green bond market, you also have to consider this to happen in the case of a social taxonomy.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think you're saying that you agree with Isabelle that in a way the metrics for social outcomes are more difficult, but you're arguing that a taxonomy would therefore be helpful.
It will therefore be helpful, exactly, because you could have a standardized metrics that puts the focus more on how to measure the impact, instead of trying to achieve a very large impact. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Tricia. What do you think about this question, and what do you think investors feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would agree with Isabelle. I think the link between what is being achieved from a social bond and long-lasting impact is probably harder to measure in the social space. And I think that putting together a taxonomy, while I don't want to discount the benefits of the common language, will be challenging, only because social impact is even more contextual than environmental impact, right? And we just talked about the economic context of Canada being different from that of Europe, and I think for social, that's even true within Europe, and the economic context of Spain might be different from that of Norway. So, again, I think anytime you are talking about, I guess, any kind of non-financial considerations that are playing a role in capital markets, I don't want to discount the value of the common language. And certainly I expect that investors won't see it, but I do think it will be challenging to achieve it in a way that is broad enough to allow the market to grow as well.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll just cover one more topic now.
Something?
Yeah, Aldo.
Sorry, I wanted to say something on this as well, because I would like to highlight the opportunity dimension of this process, of this discovery process, in fact. You have the opportunity on two accounts. The first one is that a discussion within the framework that has been established will lead to a lower degree of uncertainty. Uncertainty in terms of how things will be perceived by the market is a very, very important hindrance to disclosure. So if you clarify that, in fact, an issuer has the opportunity to describe why he thinks he's doing something well, within parameters that are not going to penalize him, then this will facilitate access to market by a broader number of issuers. The second element is that this is an opportunity for those that are active on the ground to clarify their position. So by putting these, by putting what they do in the center of what is happening and to the judgment of markets. So for me, there is definitely an element of that is very palatable to markets themselves, because there is an element of that induces people to consider strategically what they already do well in their view and what they could do better over time, put it in an organic framework that uses a language that indeed capital markets can understand and policymakers can understand. And in this way, you will see the value of also this incremental knowledge, strategic knowledge development that you have embedded in markets and that markets support. This is clearly happening, for example, at the IB. I will give you a very, very concrete example against COVID-19. So as you know, since the end of last year, we also allocate sustainability awareness bond proceeds to projects in the area of health. And the criteria that were described last year based on the taxonomy, or in a taxonomy regulation compliant way, clearly proved this year not to be sufficient to cover all the activities that the bank was called to finance in a moment of emergency. Just to give you an example, Italy, my country, hit by the sanitary crisis, could not be considered as eligible for allocation because it scored at the time in a way with regard to the WHO Universal Health Coverage Index, which is part of the criteria that we have established, in a way that would not permit us to allocate the sustainability awareness bonds. So in the context of the redefinition of the strategy of the bank in this field, it has been possible to extend the eligibility criteria and include those emergency financings at this point, making them at the same time accountable to capital markets and the public opinion. So clearly a positive enabling framework once again.
Thank you. We're going to move now to the section of the discussion where you can ask questions. Thank you to everybody who's put in questions through the chat function already. We now ask you to click on the link that you'll see displayed in your hub screen down to the left, and then we'll go into the live Q&A session, and you can continue to put in questions through the chat function there of that call, but you can also put yourself forward to ask a question as it were physically, using your own face and voice. So we'll resume there in just a moment. Just click on that link. Hello, and welcome to the question and answer session with our panel on the taxonomy. There are lots of further questions to talk about that people have asked questions about. So, you know, we're going to get started. And Tricia, I'd like to start by asking you this question. And this is really about, it refers to something you mentioned, which is about the taxonomy being a disclosure tool, and the which is of course its purpose. And the way that the disclosure works is that, as David also referred to, you as a company can disclose what proportion of your assets or your costs or your revenue are sustainable, meaning comply with the taxonomy. Now, my question is, how are investors going to use this? Because if you take, for example, say Volkswagen, right? And these are, I'm inventing the figures here, But let's say that they say, 15% of their activity is sustainable because they're 15% building electric cars. Now, will an investor mark that down in their portfolio list as a 15% sustainable company?
I think that's an interesting question, and one that most asset managers are trying to figure out right now. As you know, they're getting regulated to disclose at a portfolio level. Any portfolio that has ESG or environmental objectives by March or April of next year will need to talk about what proportion of their portfolio is environmental in relation to the EU taxonomy. So I suspect the way they will use it is to aggregate that data at a portfolio level and say, in my portfolio that is green or has environmental objectives, 20% of it has is invested in companies that derive revenues from activities as per the EU taxonomy. So I suspect it will be data that's aggregated to the portfolio level and disclosed sort of overall, specifically for portfolios that have a green or environmental objective.
And because if one was to not count the 15% of Volkswagen that was sustainable, and many other companies, of course, you'd miss out a lot of the sustainable activity going on in your portfolio.
Yes, exactly. So I think over time, what I would expect is that there is a choice to invest in portfolios that are have a significant portion or a higher proportion of their activities invested in sort of EU's definition of green, and that pushes companies to report in that way as well. So that pushes investors to invest or to direct capital more towards companies that are deriving a higher proportion of revenue from EU's definition of green, which is the EU taxonomy. So rather than labeling a company as 15% green, I would view it as a tool, like transparency as a tool that pushes the market and pushes, really incentivizes, the transition to that net zero by 2050 objective for Europe.
And have companies started to actually publish their percentages?
Not yet. I think it is one of the challenges of the EU taxonomy is the lack of data, as no one is reporting in that direction yet. So I would expect the first round of disclosures to be quite poor, where there isn't enough data to really make disclosures well. But again, I suspect the idea is that over time, companies will start to report in that direction. It is being suggested to them in the non-financial disclosure regulation.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that? Or okay.
I would say that also beyond going the disclosure of what is actually green and not green, the taxonomy and also portfolio managers will have the chance actually to report on what is actually transition aligned. So maybe in the portfolio there will be the chance to say, okay, 15% of my portfolio is aligned according to the green standard of the taxonomy, so what is actually green, and another 10% is actually aligned as a so-called transition, let's say it like this, transitional or transformation, which according to the time and the EU standard will tighten the standards and the technical screening criteria might be changed over time. So I think there's also the possibility to say, okay, X% is green, X% is transitional, and the rest is regular investments.
Yeah, that's a good point, David. Thank you. And actually, we've got a question here that, David, I'm going to ask you again, because this one is actually, the questioner has pointed it towards you. And I'll read out the question first, which is, what is your view on the market of social and sustainable bonds in the next months? But obviously, this panel is about the taxonomy. We have had another panel about social bonds. So perhaps you could just answer that question with reference to the taxonomy.
Regarding social and sustainability bonds, yes, I think there was also one question. I would say that we are seeing this year that they are growing, indeed, that the green bond markets, the green bond issuance is taking a break. And I think that they will further grow in the next years, in the next months or the next years maybe, especially when we look at COVID-19 related bonds, because the pandemic is unfortunately not over yet. And even if we have a vaccine, soon, or maybe more vaccines, I think society and the economy will deal with the aftermath of the pandemic for a long time. So additional funding will actually be needed in order to mitigate the effects of the pandemic, in order to make healthcare more resilient, to make healthcare more prepared for future issuances, and to make the bridge to the taxonomy. I think that regarding green bonds, we heard yesterday that the green bond issuance is about to grow because of yesterday's statements from Ursula von der Leyen, who said that 30% of the EU rescue funds, I think it's called the EU Next Generation, will be raised through green bonds. So we are talking about 225 billion euros, so 30% of 750 billion euros. And if we calculate this and that the program will go until 2026, I think we are talking about 50 billion euros per year. So the EU is becoming the largest issuer in the market. And putting this all together, I think that all the three types of bonds the issuance will increase in the next years. So sustainability and social, of course, mostly related to the pandemic. And the green bond issuance will also increase thanks to the European Union, the EU Commission, regarding the taxonomy. And I think that I hope that the issuances of the EU Commission, the EU Green Bond, will be in line with the taxonomy, with the EU Green Bond standard, or maybe making an acknowledgement towards it. And yes, this is my personal point of view regarding social and green.
Thank you very much. Now, Tricia, I think you've got to go very shortly, haven't you? So I don't know if you've got time to just quickly give me a view on one question, which is this question about the taxonomy becoming stricter over time. And you know, basically, how are investors and issuers thinking about that issue? Does that pose problems in itself?
I would say there's no real answer to that now, but certainly it is a challenge, particularly for issuers that are looking to align green bond frameworks with the taxonomy. So how it gets implemented, I think, is a little bit of an open question. But certainly keeping in mind the objective of the taxonomy, you know, which is the net zero by 2050, I think that pledge makes a lot of sense to make the taxonomy stricter over time. However, I think implementation may be challenging, particularly the green bond market. So that is something that will come with time.
Okay, thank you. Well, Tricia, I believe you've got to go. So I'd just like to thank you very much for joining us. It's been great to have you on the panel. And thank you for all your interesting thoughts. There are more questions from the audience, so I think we'll carry on talking. And Isabelle, perhaps, could I ask you about that point about the taxonomy getting stricter? How does that feel from your point of view?
Well, I think they will have to conclude whether they grandfather bonds from the start that are aligned with the taxonomy at the time that they're issued. I suppose the difficulty comes if you're not funding projects immediately that use all the proceeds. So, you know, if they're tightening every few years and there's an expectation that some of your use of the proceeds of your green bond don't happen for a few years, and at that point they tighten criteria, that may create problems. But in essence, I think that there will have to be a conclusion that they are grandfathered over time. Whether that makes it harder for the reporting by investors of what they have, yes, it would still be considered consistent with the EU Green Bond standard, but does that make it problematic for them in their reporting? Will they not have to nod to what is consistent with the current taxonomy or not? I don't know. So I think there are definitely issues that will need to be addressed. But I would think for issuers that were looking to use the proceeds quickly, that should be less problematic. That should be clearer.
Okay, thank you. David, were you going to say something?
I agree totally. I think this tightening of the EU green bonds taxonomy thresholds is also a lot about the transition activities. So in order to get all on board, also these economic sectors that cannot be green overnight, that need some certain time in order to adapt. And of course, the idea is to tighten the thresholds in order to motivate also the issuers to put a strategy, a sustainable strategy behind it. So once the issuer decides to issue a bond aligned with the EU taxonomy, let's call it a transition bond, there should also be a strategy behind it that acknowledges the tightening over time. And as Isabelle said, it is an issue, yes, but let's see. I think I'm optimistic when it comes to the green, actually really green projects, but regarding for example, a cement producer that is allowed to issue, let's say, a certain amount of tons of CO2 per ton of cement, it might be an issue for him in order to adapt all the time, maybe annually, maybe every 2 or 3 years, to the tightening of the criteria in the taxonomy.
Okay, thank you. And perhaps a question somewhat related to that, which is to do with small and medium-sized enterprises. Now, there's an ambition in the European Union for SMEs to play a greater role in capital markets, and this is partly what the Capital Markets Union policy is about. How easy is it going to be for companies like that to use the taxonomy?
Well, on the one hand, it will be easier because they will know actually of what can be considered green and what not. So until which threshold my economic activity can be considered as green and aligned with the EU taxonomy. It will be also a guidance regarding of how to structure a green bond framework, since the EU Green Bond Standard gives already a certain template and a certain guidance. But of course, the complexity of the taxonomy will be one major challenge for the small and medium enterprises.
It'll be down to people like you to advise them, I expect.
Exactly. So it's actually good for me. So I will have lots to do in the upcoming years.
Yeah.
And yeah, this will actually be the job to help to guide small and medium enterprises on their sustainable way, on their sustainable trajectory towards the sustainable finance markets. I think the duty will be in order to make them the complex taxonomy, more understandable, and to show them the advantages of actually to say, hey, okay, my green bond, the green bond I issue, is in line, mostly in line with the first two environmental objectives of the taxonomy.
Perhaps something else I could ask you is this concept of activities in the taxonomy. The taxonomy is based on defining economic activities or categorizing them. Mm-hmm. Now, and you know, is that the way issuers and investors actually think about their investments? Isabelle?
We focus on projects and investments, assets, which will normally be made up of many different activities. And I do think the translation is extremely difficult. So the green bond market is all about green projects, investments, activities, and trying to relate the taxonomy to those is remarkably difficult. So I think it will remain a significant challenge trying to work out this translation. And certainly the guidance that has been given after previous consultations where this has arisen still looks very deficient in trying to guide people to a better understanding of that. And I think the other view is that when you're talking about projects and investments and activities, context is everything. Where it's cited, how it's done, you know, all these different things are so critical that it is very different than taking an activity more in the abstract somewhere in the EU. And obviously it makes it so much more complex when that activity is happening, or that project and series of activities are happening outside the EU in terms of relating it to the taxonomy.
And is that because outside the EU generally standards are lower, or is it that they just use different metrics?
I think the context is different. There can be different priorities in terms of deciding what, pollution is the single biggest problem according to China. So therefore, actually relating to their own context, what would be defined as the sort of overarching aim of a project or investment is probably related to that more than it is to perhaps GHG reductions or something like that. So again, what you would expect to report, how you would look at it, how it is framed, what the context of it is all very critical in determining how you should report on your project. But obviously the EU has put things in, and it may become more apparent when we go beyond mitigation and adaptation to other things as to how you might report precisely that activity, but in a different context. But at the moment, you're looking at the activities only through that purview, which makes it narrower and harder to apply, I would say.
And just so that we can understand fully, and can you give an example of how a project comprises multiple activities?
Well, most projects do, but in green buildings, I suppose would be an easy one to understand. You've got the where it's sited is going to be critical. Is it near shops? Does it have access to public transport? The lighting, the air, the materials used in it, all these different factors are part of water usage, waste management for that green building. All of that comes within the context of a green building. It's not just seen through the purview of greenhouse gas reductions. And therefore, trying to look at all the different aspects of your green building should be important in terms of the project and deciding if it's a very solid green project. And it works slightly differently in that way to the taxonomy, because the taxonomy, of course, says that you have to at least meet one of the objectives significantly. And it doesn't matter if you're performing well and meaningfully, but not deemed significant in the context of the technical criteria along a single line. It doesn't matter if that's across 6 or 7 different objectives that you're achieving these positive benefits as you would with a truly green building. In relation to the taxonomy, it's saying that one of those needs to be the significant aspect. And again, I think that's another complexity that we need to see how difficult it is to translate from the practice of doing projects against the language of the taxonomy.
So you mean, for example, a building that has amazing lighting, right? It has state-of-the-art lighting, could qualify, even if its washrooms were not amazing, as long as they were sort of not terrible.
Well, I don't think lighting per se would be part of the taxonomy, but if you're making significant greenhouse gas reductions looking at an aspect, but it's not good from links for transportation, and it's not good from a water usage perspective, and it hasn't dealt with sort of waste aspects, all these things may be deemed irrelevant. So the question is, does it do significant harm? That's the question the taxonomy will ask across the other things, rather than is it actually achieving positive benefits across those? So, I would have thought that a green building that achieves multiple benefits, even if it doesn't meet the technical criteria across a single one, may be the better green building than one that does marvelously on energy efficiency and not very good on these other criteria.
And after all, there are standards for green buildings already. Yeah, David?
Yeah, just wanted to add that the taxonomy also allows the so-called, when you look at the real estate sector, the building sector, the so-called individual improvement measures. according to which you can make some small projects inside a house, for example, installing a new boiler, an energy efficient boiler that is also explicitly mentioned in the taxonomy. And this is what Isabelle said, that you might improve certain things. You might target one of the 6 environmental objectives, but maybe for the rest of 5 environmental objectives that do no significant harm might be considered in this example of the buildings a little bit too weak. Maybe an option would be to rephrase it, to rename it for let's support the remaining 5 environmental objectives.
Yeah, good point. Okay, I think we'll just take one more question, and which is about whether, I mean, during the drafting of the taxonomy legislation, there were ideas, especially in the European Parliament, that it should, instead of this taxonomy that describes what's sustainable, which we've got now, that you should have a sort of all-encompassing taxonomy or a rainbow taxonomy, which goes right. It's a bit more like the certificate you get on the side of a washing machine, which has every grade from the greenest to the worst, right? And that things should be graded. All economic activities should receive a grade somewhere on the scale. Now, I think we touched on this in the discussion earlier, but I just quite quickly, perhaps you could each give a view on whether you think that's desirable and could that ever happen, or is it difficult to imagine? David, why don't you go first?
Yeah, just to ask, you mean a grading of the green, of the environmental performance of each economic activity?
Exactly.
I think we have the second party opinion provider Cicero that uses these shades of green. So we have light green, medium green, and dark green that gives investors and also issues a certain guidance of what is actually sustainable, environmentally friendly, what actually paves the way towards a CO2 neutral future, and what is some sort of a bridge technology. From my personal point of view, I would say the taxonomy has the advantage that there is no such grading up until now. So we see that an activity is in line with the taxonomy, with the technical screening criteria or not. One sidestep, one group in between will be the transitional activities that will be tightened over time, as we already mentioned before. But I personally like the idea that there will be at least no differentiation between the different shades of green, between the economic, the environmental activities of the environmental performance of the economic activities.
It's just simpler, you think?
Yes, the simpler is an easier approach. Has advantages and disadvantages, but this is my point of view on it.
Okay, thanks, David. Isabelle?
Well, I think it's already very complex. So I don't think we need to add to complexity. And I think that it's important, I would say, I agree with David to the extent that we need both the deep green and well, not just both, we need the deep green and the transition activities and the enabling activities, many of which are already deep green, but may not be. And that therefore, the differentiation is not unduly helpful. I mean, it's useful to think in terms of those 3 categories. I think in terms of talking about dark green, light green, different things, we're just going to add complexities that we don't need. I think I would never have thought that a green taxonomy would be the most help. I would have thought that the most helpful thing would have been to have a brown taxonomy, to say, these are the things that we need to move away from. These are the things that we shouldn't be doing. You know, so that creates much greater clarity, because you're not going to change them the whole time. You're not suddenly going to arrive at the notion that coal's a marvelous thing. And that would be another language that would be very helpful. So I think that the combination of looking at how much more that you're doing in the space of the deep green, the transition, the enabling, in combination with what is brown and how much you're moving away from that, would be the more helpful place to go if we want to go anywhere with adding complexity.
Well,
and this will be also this will be also a straight definition of brown. So they would not be, in case there is a brown taxonomy, I would also agree to a straight definition of brown and not brown, and not implementing some sort of shades of brown.
Okay. Thank you so much. Aldo wasn't able to join us for the Q&A, and Tricia had to go, but you've been a superb panel. I personally have learned a lot from this discussion, and I'm sure our audience have enjoyed it and had many thoughts provoked. So I'm very grateful to you for sharing your time and your expertise with us. David and Isabelle, thank you. And to the audience, if you the next session we have on is in about just under 3/4 of an hour. So if you go to your sessions link in Hub and click on the discussion on green and sustainability linked finance, which is at 11:30 London time. So don't miss that. Thank you so much to the audience and to our speakers.